Welcome to this episode of the VO2 Lounge podcast. This is episode 27. Today's episode is going to be on concussion with a specific focus in reality on concussion within rugby, seeing as the Rugby World Cup is currently underway and we have even seen the introduction, I suppose before the World Cup, but of the bunker to try and catch more of the, let's call it, dangerous play in relation specifically, I suppose, to concussion. But it's definitely something that over the past few years has become more prevalent in the game's management of it, not just at the elite level, but at the sort of amateur level. Places like England Rugby have brought out lowering of the tackle height. It's been trialled at various different levels, and as we'll come to find out in various studies that we'll look at, the results vary, and there's a lot in this. There's player welfare, but there's also the enjoyment and the sacrifice to some extent that the players are making and almost willingness to take the risk. And then there's the viewership and not wanting the game to change too much. But we're going to start off with World Rugby's stamp. For most of this episode, I'm just going to kind of assume that anyone who's got as far as clicking on this knows about rugby, watches rugby, and is into rugby. But just in case, World Rugby is the world governing body, essentially. And on their website, they have a section called Under Medical, which has concussion guidance for non-medical professionals. And it essentially goes over what their standpoint is to some extent, what concussion is, how it can be recognised, how it should be managed, player return to sport of different ages, so like under 18s, I think they even go into under 12s, and then over 18s and like the adult game. But the introduction to it is kind of outlines really all you need to know from World Rugby, at least from their point of view and their stance on concussion. Now, if you are a player or you have a child, for example, who's a player, I think it's a really useful resource that doesn't take particularly long to read through. So I'd recommend take a look yourself. But World Rugby strongly recommends that all players seek the highest level of medical care available following concussion or a suspected concussion. They have a little section on concussion facts. They state that concussion is a traumatic brain injury. All concussions are serious. Concussions can occur without loss of consciousness, and these are kind of some of the key facts that sometimes get overlooked in how concussion at the lower down, because really to some extent obviously we are conscious of the elite level and obviously the contacts can be greater, but I almost to some extent feel like there can be a greater risk for concussions to go unseen at the lower level to some extent, because you haven't got the cameras on and there's it could be harder to spot it when it happens if the person hasn't clearly been knocked unconscious. But they really do just outline what to look for, how to treat it, and what currently is thought to be an acceptable process of return to play. It's not incredibly detailed in saying day by day what you're doing, but it is at least a guideline, and essentially, as it states, you should really just seek medical care from a professional, and the first thing you should be really doing is just no exercise for the first 24 to 48 hours, and then in that process you're going to go see a medical professional. Now, the aim of this episode really is kind of just peruse through some of the literature, some studies. We'll start as far back as 2001, just to kind of get some background as to what was going on then at least, and you can see the common sort of trend that's going on. But the first study I'm going to look at is on the Journal of Athletic Training, and it's titled Concussion in Rugby, the Hidden Epidemic. This was published back in 2001, but it obviously is still relevant in the sense that this is referencing just concussion in general and the trends that they saw. So their general objective was to determine the incidence of concussion in high school rugby players and compare the findings with relevant published literature. So they were using one US high school rugby program, and then these were two teams were then followed for 3 years, and they effectively measured the injury rate, injury severity, and time withheld from competition post, or in total, I suppose. Now their results were that they discovered 17 concussions, accounting for 25% of all reported injuries. The incident rate of concussion was 3.8 per 1,000 athletes' exposures, or 11.3 per player season, per 100 player seasons. Of the 17 concussions, 14 of them were grade 1, 2 were grade 2, and 1 was grade 3. To clarify the grading, because I hadn't actually heard of this myself as I was reading through, but grade 1 has a dazed feeling lasting less than about a minute. So it could be that the player is removed from the field, but really after they're removed from the field, it's the kind of incident that historically the player would have probably been put back on the field because they're like, look, I feel fine. Grade 2 concussion is cloudy, senses last longer, so maybe the player is feeling off for the remainder of the game and stays off the pitch. Loss of consciousness is then grade 3, considered for less than a minute, and then grade 4 is anything longer than a minute. Now, they concluded that the incidence of concussion in the study was higher than previously reported in other studies. So they effectively just went through various different studies that themselves were in various countries. So in 1983, there was a study in South Africa, Australia. 87, you again had South Africa and Australia. 90, South Africa. 92, a New Zealand study. 94, Australian study. 95, a Scottish study. And 96, another Scottish study. And then 98, a New Zealand study. Now, in these studies, they are suggesting that in the study list, the maximum incidence rate per 100 player seasons, the maximum found was 9.78, and that was in 1983 in Australia. Again, these varied though, however, across high school age and adult males, and then some of them even used mixed ages and both sexes. So there's a bit of variation across the studies, but essentially they are stating that from the studies they looked at, that these rates appeared to be increasing. Now, they are stating that much of the world's rugby is played in countries where there is a shortage of a medical professional well trained to recognise and manage concussions. In addition, until recently, the International Rugby Board ruled that any player with a concussion must be suspended from active competition for 3 weeks, even for a grade 1 injury that resolved within minutes. And the effect of this rule has probably been dampen the reporting of symptoms by concussed players. Now, they've then gone to say that as a result of these two factors, the previous factor was that using data from a large high school-based rugby program in the United States, they have demonstrated that incidence of concussion in rugby is probably much higher than previously suggested because of this 3-week ban, essentially. And they are assuming that the incidence has been underestimated, and in some cases by a wider margin. So efforts better prevent, recognise and manage these injuries need to be implemented in the game of rugby. Developing accurate incidence data will assist us, them, I guess rugby in general, in raising awareness of the problem of concussion in rugby. So this is all the way back in 2001. So clearly, the reason I have come to this study is because not necessarily how its validity or anything like that. I simply came to it because I read it and thought, this must be recent. Because to me, concussions... I played rugby between the ages of 10 and about 21. And for reference, I was 10 in the year 2009. So 2009. So, and it didn't really seem like a big deal, concussion, in the sense of, I don't really remember many people coming off. And so maybe that's because of age, that there weren't concussions. But to me, I didn't realise it was such a pressing matter, even as far back as 2001. Which I found interesting because a lot of the common trends in this study, in the sense of what they were concerned about, the fact that it was being underreported, the fact that having a 3-week ban, although in an ideal world where, you have some method of measuring a concussion so you can be completely objective about it and do not rely on any subjective measurements like asking the player questions or them being assessed by a medical professional who can get things wrong at the end of the day, especially if the person is facing a 3-week ban and is worried about their wages or being selected for the next year or whatever. That person may deliberately or undeliberately be misleading them to some extent. So it's clearly been an issue for a while. So, let's move on to the next study. So, moving into somewhat more of the, not quite the present day, obviously, but fast forwarding almost 18 years to 2018, so 17 years. A study titled, "On average, a professional rugby union player is more likely than not to sustain a concussion after 25 matches." Which, given that, a league can have 14 teams in it, say, I forget exactly the numbers. So, obviously you're not going to play yourself, so 26 games. I mean, it's essentially saying that you're more likely than not to have one concussion each game. Now, the objectives they set out was to investigate concussion injury rates, the likelihood of sustaining concussion relative to the number of rugby union matches, and the risk of subsequent injuries following a concussion. These are not necessarily concussive injuries, just injuries in general. The method that they used was a 4-season, so 2012, 13, and 2015-16, prospective cohort study of injuries in professional level club and international rugby union. Injuries per 1,000 player match hours, severity, days lost per injury, and the number of professional matches conferring a larger risk of concussion were determined. The risk of injury following concussion was then assessed using a survival model. Now, they concluded that concussion incidents increased, while severity remained unchanged during 4 years of the study. Playing more than 25 matches in 2015-2016 season meant that sustaining concussion was more likely than not sustaining a concussion, and the 38% greater injury risk after a concussive injury compared with non-concussive injury suggests that return to play protocols warrant investigation. So essentially what they have done here is, over the course of 4 seasons, assessed the rate of concussions, and then also wanted to know whether after a concussive injury, whether you are at greater risk of further injury in comparison to sustaining a non-concussive injury and returning to play. Essentially meaning that if you're at greater risk, then more needs to be done, because currently the non-concussive injury return to play protocols are more effective in returning the player to sport than the protocols for concussive injuries. Now, as we go through the study, you effectively get to various figures that outline essentially what's going on. I'll put the study below, and I'll put them in order of where I've spoken about them, essentially. So when I mention a new study, you can just open the next one along. And if you're listening and not sat down, as I imagine most people are not listening to this, and got their pen and paper or whatever and able to look at these studies, but essentially they plotted the match injury incidence of concussion in club international rugby combined across 4 seasons, and it's essentially just going up year on year. They plot a table that splits out club rugby and international rugby, showing international rugby is consistently higher, but at the same time that club rugby, there are also incidences, but that both of these are trending upwards. They then go into detail about the hazard ratio between injuries following a concussion versus following a non-concussive injury, split up by body region, such as head and neck, upper limb, abdomen, chest and back, pelvic region, so on and so on, and highlight the fact that across various of these body parts, if not all, some of them they were less confident in it fitting, some of them they had lower confidence on. However, all of them, there was an increased risk. For whatever reason, there was a twofold increase in pelvic region, so like buttock and groin, following and this is worth noting that some of these, for example, like the head and neck, upper limb, pelvic region, lower limb, getting an injury and then coming back to play, there was still an increase in the likelihood of being injured again. But, for example, in the lower limb, there was a 20% increased chance, right, of the occurrence. Whereas in comparison, after a concussive injury, there is a 110% increase in the chance of. So rather than the hazard ratio being 1.21, it's now 2.1 versus obviously the baseline of 0, I suppose you could say. But they outline the fact that concussive injuries across various different body parts seem to show, on average, a 48% increase in risk of injury again versus generic injuries. Now, they outline the limitations in the study. And I think it's important to go over the limitations because they help understand the limitations in assessing this in general in the current day. Now, in this instance, they had a small number of teams involved in the study, and that is a crucial limitation. You don't have a large sample across. Ideally, you'd have the whole championship, or you just have multiple championships, for example, to truly assess this. But obviously, there's more cost, there's more legwork, and so on. They do state, though, that the injury data was checked every month of every season, minimizing the number of incomplete injury records. And additionally, by tracking international players from clubs to the national team, they have provided the first subsequent injury analysis in professional sport that has included all time loss injuries sustained by a player, regardless of when it occurred. And then they just go on to conclude that rugby union players are more likely than not to sustain a concussion after 25 matches. Doesn't mean now these probability things, it doesn't mean that 25 matches on the 26th you're going to get a concussion, or that you only are going to get one. There will be people who do 50 matches and don't get a single concussion. But there'll also be people who do 5 and get 3. Hopefully not, but you see, this is just giving an idea that on average, every 25 games, you are becoming, that is the point at which you're susceptible on average for a concussion. And that if you've had a concussion, you should be aware that there is a higher probability that you sustain a subsequent injury versus non-concussive. Now, why this is, they state that they're unsure, but at least it's a step in the right direction, and that from here you would hope there are some ways on the guidelines of return to play, essentially. Now, coming on to what is actually present in various forms of the game. I believe in France and in England they've lowered the tackle height. Now, a 2019 study titled "Does Reducing the Height of the Tackle Through Law Change in Elite Men's Rugby Union?" In this specific instance, it's the Rugby Championship in England, which is Tier 2, so you got the Prem and then you got the Championship. Reduce the incidence of concussion, a controlled study in 126 games. So the objectives were that most concussions in rugby union occur during the tackle. That's what they've identified. They investigated whether legislation to lower maximum tackle height would change tackle behaviour and reduce concussion incidence rate. The method used is an observational evaluation using a prospective cohort design of 12 elite men's teams played in 2 competitions during the 2018-29 season. The championship, 90 games in total, retained standard laws of rugby for the tackle, and the Championship Cup, which was 36 games, used revised laws. The maximum tackle height was lowered from the line of the shoulders on the ball carrier to a line of the armpits. So not really a major change. We're really not talking much, but it gives you a bit more slipping room, I suppose, for the tackler until they're effectively making contact with the head. Now, their results found that the lower tackle height setting, there was a significant lower proportion of tackles in which ball carriers and tacklers were upright, in which the tackler's initial contact was to the ball's carrier head or neck, and in which initial contact was above the line of the ball carrier's armpit. So the concussion incidence ratio did not differ between conditions unexpectedly compared with the standard tackle height setting. Tacklers in the lower tackle height setting were themselves concussed at a higher rate as measured by incidence. So interestingly, somewhat, I suppose, maybe not what you'd expect, but the tacklee, the person being tackled, became safer because the tackler is away from their head. But I suppose because the other tackle is now lower, they're coming into contact maybe with knees or something else. But we'll get into that in a minute, because to me, moving from the shoulder line to the armpit line isn't really drastic enough. I could understand if they moved it to like maybe below the rib, or even lower, like they said you had to hit the hips. At that point, then fair enough, but it's still pretty high up the body. So we'll get into that. But their conclusions were legislating to lower the height of the tackle meant that tacklers made contact with the ball carrier's head and neck 30% less often than prior. This did not influence concussion incidence rates, however, and tacklers in the lower tackle height setting suffered more concussions than did tacklers in the standard tackle height setting. So, taking a moment to have a closer look at the study, I mean, it's quite thorough in the fact that they have analysed the tackle characteristics. So, they have broken them up into 1-player tackles, 2-player tackles, 3-player tackles, tackle types. They've got active shoulder, passive shoulder, tap tackles, smooth tackles, like lift illegal, no arms illegal, high tackle illegal, tackle in the air also illegal, tackle direction, body position. They're really, I think it's a good way to approach it, in the sense that if you start off with more buckets in a way than you think you need, then you can always kind of consolidate at the end, I suppose. But they then went into game events expressed per game, and broke them up obviously into the championship with the standard tackle height, and then the championship cup, the lower tackle height, and a sort of assessed like the amount of time ball is in play, ball out of play, carries, like total carries, tackle events, total tackles, the number of passes, offloads, steal attempts, rucks, line out, scrums. Because essentially what you're doing here as well is you don't want to, part of what the argument is with all this law changes and introduction of changing of the tackles, people get concerned that the game is going to change too much, which it would if you completely eliminated contact, because that's what the sport's all about to some extent. But a secondary characteristic, thought, key point, I don't know how you want to put it, but essentially is that the change in the tackle could have an impact on how the game is played to some extent. Carries you want to assess, because I suppose if you're seeing greater concussions in, say, the championship, for example, they are stating that there's 202 versus 187 in the championship cup. Then if you saw less concussions in the championship cup relative to the number, as in uncorrected for the number of contacts made, then that could be pointing you into why maybe there was less concussions. Passes, offloads, for example, offloads seemed to be unchanged, but you would think that maybe if you lower the tackle height enough to the point where you can no longer smother the ball in the tackle, then it promotes offloads and greater dynamics to the game. You'd see less rucks, which, funnily enough, even though there were identical offloads, fewer passes in the Championship Cup. there were also fewer rucks that sort of didn't align to carries and tackles. So I don't know what was quite going on there, but I suppose maybe if I went further into it, but it confused me a little bit. But essentially, it's somewhat trended in the direction you would have thought, but didn't. It wasn't really a great enough deviation for it to be obvious, I suppose. They also then, within those tackle characteristics, they obviously outlined what the averages were with the change and prior to the change. So as you would sort of expect, the carrier body position also changed, likely because in response to the tackler being in a slightly different position. So for example, there was 25 incidences of an upright tackler, whereas 20 in the cup, so with the lowered tackle heights, partially bent, greater number, and then fully bent, greater number. And then tackler diving, this remained essentially the same, which if you think in the game, the point where you're diving is essentially by the line when you're making tiny amounts of ground. And that's not really affected by tackle height because it's not even really a tackle. It's more just of you eye up a point in the ground, dive to it to ensure that the person with the ball doesn't gain too much ground doing their dive tackle, their dive for the line, essentially. They're not really tackles in the same way. So that kind of all makes sense. And then the initial point of contact on the ball carrier, head and neck was lowered, shoulder and armpit also was lowered. There was greater to the torso, greater to the upper leg, and very similar in the lower leg, because again, tap tackle maybe, which is somewhat unaffected by tackle height. So all trending in the expected direction. Same for the initial point of contact. It was overall lower. So you just imagine that zone, that tackle zone, if you had like a red box around a tackler, it's all just basically been shifted down. So you haven't got a massive increase in like tackling of the legs and dive tackles because they were irrelevant to tackle height anyway. They have some graphs showing it's kind of a little bit sporadic. Seems to be a round where there was a particularly high number of concussions in one round of the Championship Cup, which I look at wondering, is this an erroneous result? Because then that overall lifts the reduced tackle height on average above the standard law. Now, if we're going any further, the conclusions they made was reducing the maximum height of the legal tackle from the line of the shoulder to the line of the armpit in elite men's rugby resulted in a desired change in player behaviour. Ball carriers entered contact partially bent and tacklers entered at contact fully bent at the waist for more frequently. However, overall concussion incidents did not decrease, and in the tacklers, both concussion incidents and propensity increased significantly. A better understanding of the interaction between ball carrying and tackle behaviour is needed to inform future trials of more context-specific and game-specific strategies to reduce concussion. Now, the limitations they have highlighted in their study was that the observational design employed does not allow control over other elements that may change player behaviour over time, such as the weather and ground conditions, which is incredibly prevalent in the UK, of course. I've added that, but very prevalent. The time and the season and the playing squad selected for matches. In particular, the relative importance placed on two competitions in the study, and consequently, playing squad selected may have influenced the tackle skill of the players. In addition, concussion incidence rates were 20% higher in the post-law variation than pre-law variation periods, despite the application of standard laws relating to tackle height in both periods. Now, this might reflect changes in reporting due to greater focus on concussion for this study. Now, future studies should involve stakeholders, i.e. players, coaches and referees, more closely and provide a longer preparatory period. Now, I think that the limitations here of this study kind of highlight where the issue somewhat lies. On one hand, you have in general recording of concussions will have been going up over the last 10 years because there is more awareness. And so if you look for something harder, you are going to find more of it. If I go into my garden and never look if my garden's on a gold mine and I never dig in my garden, I'm never going to find gold. If I start digging more frequently, I'm going to find lots of gold, am I not? So it's somewhat of a case of what you're looking for, you are going to find. This is not to say that that is 100% the case. Now, with this incidence of the concussion rates not really changing, and if anything getting worse towards the tackler, that kind of to me just highlights the fact that maybe this change was made sort of quickly and the teams had not identified the changes, and that possibly there's just musculature in the players and coordination that isn't developed yet to tackle in this way. And really maybe it just highlights that there needs to be not only a law change, but a protocol change in the clubs of how they are managing tackling techniques, avoiding more upright tackling, and maybe there's some strength and conditioning that goes into it. Maybe there is a postural change that will allow for these tackles to be made at the lower height, eliminate the tackler increase in concussion rate, and therefore improve the overall safety of the game, really. So where does this leave us then? Well, I suppose it leaves us with an opportunity for me to cast some personal anecdote and what I think of all of it, really. I used to play the sport for about 10 years. And I don't know, while I was in and amongst it, in the depths of it, didn't really care that much. I never got knocked unconscious. That's not to say I never had a concussion, because I don't know. Because concussions, as stated by World Rugby, do not require you to be rendered unconscious. So there is an element of me in my post-rugby playing life where I wonder what possible damage could have been caused. But there's the element of how much it means to the players, really. It's just there's such a bond created over the fact that there is contact involved, which is a double-edged sword, because on one end it's such a fulfilling experience, and there's nothing that feels better than winning in rugby, really. It's one of the greatest feelings. But because of the fact that you are putting your body up there against another probably reasonably large individual, and it also means that if you do get a head knock, you don't want to put your hand up and say, oh, I think I need to come off. Especially at the non-elite level where you've got 3 substitutes. Maybe I'm too far removed and maybe now there is greater number, but at least when I was playing there was only 3 substitutes, which I suppose helped with prevented clubs from buying up players effectively and having enormous benches. But it is what it is, really. And I think it's going to definitely be a hard one to solve. In an ideal world, you have ages to solve it, but there's already cases that come up of people with CTE and the destructive nature of it. I mean, the Open Uni has an article that, again, I will link down below, that kind of has some player thoughts in there. So they've stated that one player prone to injury was Shontaine Hape, former England. I really do apologize, I'm not very great at reading names, but a former England centre who gave his point of view on concussion in rugby and said how players are regularly pressured to return quickly from head injuries, and claims that they routinely cheated cognitive tests designed to monitor their brain function throughout the season. And the former England centre admitted he'd been concussed close to 20 times in his career, and said his condition got so bad he couldn't remember his PIN number and was left with depression, constant migraines and memory loss. There are many players like Hape whose careers end abruptly from concussion. And then research conducted in England in 2018-2019 seasons shows that 20% of professional rugby players sustained at least one match concussion. Now, it's statements like that where you just hear and you feel for the person. But at the same time, if they had been, I don't know, if they had been told the risk up front, would they have played on? I don't know. And I think we're in a good spot at the moment in the sense that that risk is now incredibly clear to people. So if the decision needs to be made, the decision is there. The question now lies, how do you get to a point where the risk can be mitigated adequately to make the sport as safe as it can be, but that there's a certain element that will remain. There will always be the risk unless it becomes touch, at which point you do lose the sport that many people love. And with that, this brings us to the end of the episode. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating and sharing the podcast. Sharing the podcast is the greatest way to help spread and grow the show. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the VO2lounge@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.